Picture this. It's the 1950s. A young man walks into CIA headquarters for his first day of work. He's fresh out of Yale. He's got the right handshake, the right tie, the right last name. And somewhere in his suitcase, dog-eared and well-loved, is a paperback novel about a British spy boy running around colonial India. That novel is not American. It is not about America. It was written by an Englishman about the British Empire, 30 years before the CIA even existed. And here's the twist: that novel, along with a real-life British desert warrior in flowing white robes, and a French general who liked to talk about spreading peace like a drop of oil in water, and a forgotten American army bureaucrat with a face like a bloodhound, are basically the secret godparents of the CIA. Today we are going deep into a part of CIA history that never makes the movies. Forget Cuba, forget Berlin, forget the Bay of Pigs for a minute. We are going back before the agency even existed, to find out where its imagination actually came from, and the answer is going to surprise you. Because it is not the Founding Fathers. It is the British Empire. So if you ask the CIA about its own family tree, the official story is very tidy and very patriotic. It will tell you spies helped win the Revolutionary War against the British. They will tell you about scouts on the American frontier. They will even bring up General Pershing chasing the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa across the border in 1916, with a young cavalry officer named William Donovan riding along. That same Donovan would later found the Office of Strategic Services in World War II, the direct ancestor of the CIA. So the official bedtime story goes: American spies, American soil, American values, straight line to Donovan, straight line to the CIA. Simple, clean, homegrown. Except historian Hugh Wilford, whose book we are working from today, says, hold on a second, that is not the whole story, not even close. Because the CIA was a foreign intelligence agency, its job was to go overseas and understand the rest of the world. And when you are building an organization to do that, you do not just inherit your own country's habits. You start absorbing the habits of everyone else who is already good at that game. And in the early 20th century, nobody, and I mean nobody, was better at running a global spy network than the British Empire. So alongside its American family tree, the CIA has a whole second bloodline, a foreign one, mostly British, with a little French mixed in, and it did not arrive through official channels or founding documents. It arrived through books, through celebrity gossip, through schoolboy fantasies, and through one very particular kind of masculine daydream that historians now call imperial romance. Stick with that phrase, imperial romance, because it is going to be our thread for the whole episode. Let's start with the writer. Rudyard Kipling was born in 1865 in colonial Bombay, and he adored India as a kid. He described it in one letter as a place of heat, temple incense, and endless wonders. But he was also, without apology, a true believer in the British Empire. He is the guy who wrote The White Man's Burden, the poem that basically told Americans, hey, you just took the Philippines from Spain, welcome to the Empire Club, here is your assignment. Now here is the part that matters for our story. In 1901, Kipling published a novel called Kim. It is about an orphan boy named Kimball O'Hara, half Irish, raised on the streets of India, who ends up getting recruited into British intelligence and sent out to spy on the Russians along India's northern frontier. This rivalry between the British and the Russians in that region even had its own nickname at the time. People called it the Great Game. Sound familiar? It is basically an early dress rehearsal for the Cold War, except with camels instead of nuclear submarines. And Kim is not just an adventure story. A lot of historians now consider it the first great spy novel. Full stop. It captures something that had been quietly true for decades. That British rule in India was actually incredibly fragile. There were only around 1,200 British officials trying to govern almost 300 million people. 1,200 against 300 million. That is not confidence. That is a nervous system running on caffeine and paranoia. So the British leaned hard on local networks of informants, agents, and eavesdroppers, and lived in a constant, low-grade anxiety about hidden plots. Kipling captured that anxiety perfectly, wrapped in a boy's adventure story. And Kim did something remarkable. It did not just describe the British spy world, it helped create it. In the years right after the novel came out, Britain was gripped by what people call the spy mania, this public panic about German agents hiding everywhere. And in 1909, that panic pushed the British government to create something brand new. The Secret Service Bureau, that single organization, would eventually split into the two agencies people still talk about today: MI6 for foreign intelligence and MI5 for domestic security. So think about that chain of causation for a second. A novel about a fictional orphan spy helped spark public hysteria, which helped create the actual, real, physical British intelligence services. Fiction built the plumbing that fact would later run through. And Kipling was massively popular in America too. He lived in the United States for several years in the 1890s, married an American woman, and genuinely believed Britain and America shared the same destiny as, in his words, an Anglo-Saxon power. When America took the Philippines from Spain in 1898, Kipling personally urged Americans to keep it as a colony, and that is literally what the white man's burden was about. Subtitle: The United States and the Philippines. Kipling died in 1936, believing his beloved empire was already dying around him. But his stories did not die. They kept working on the imaginations of young readers for decades, including, as we will see very shortly, a whole generation of future American spies. Now let's cross the channel, because the CIA's ancestry is not purely British. There is a French branch of the family tree too, and it belongs to a man named Hubert Lyautey. Lyautey was born in 1854 into an aristocratic French military family. As a young man, he developed a fascination with the Arab world of North Africa, a region the French called the Maghreb. After a posting to colonial Algeria, some historians have speculated about his personal life too, including his sexuality, and suggested he may have found the male-dominated culture of colonial military service more comfortable than life back home in France. But the reason Lyautey matters to CIA history is his strategy. Working under his mentor, Joseph Gallieni, in French Indochina, Lyautey helped develop something called progressive occupation. The idea was, instead of just conquering territory with brute force, you send the army in building roads, telegraph lines, medical clinics as you go. He had this poetic phrase for it, spreading like a drop of oil in water, tache d'huile in French. On paper, it sounds almost gentle: bring civilization, win hearts, pacify peacefully. In practice, less gentle. In Madagascar, Lyautey and his commander Gallieni cracked down on resistance with what one historian bluntly calls a bloody campaign, including the assassination and exile of local rulers, alongside serious upgrades to French surveillance of Malagasy society, including newly imported fingerprinting technology. So the poetic version was peaceful conquest. The real version had a very sharp edge hiding just underneath. Later, as the top French official in Morocco starting in 1912, Lyautey doubled down on this style: build railroads and schools, keep the local sultan visibly in charge so it does not look like direct colonial rule, and try to win over local elites rather than crushing everyone by force. The French public back home loved it. They called it a kind of Morocco mania. Moroccans themselves were considerably less enthusiastic, and armed resistance in the mountainous Rif region eventually forced Lyautey's own resignation in 1925. Here is the part that connects directly to the CIA though. Late in his life, Lyautey did one more job for the French government. In 1931, he organized a massive public exhibition in Paris called the Exposition Coloniale Internationale, designed purely to build up domestic French pride in the empire. It featured full-scale replicas of colonial villages, and even a giant plaster reproduction of Angkor Wat. Millions of French citizens attended, some multiple times. So here is Lyautey's double legacy for the CIA. First, his population-centered, win the hearts and minds before you resort to force approach to fighting insurgents would echo decades later in American counterinsurgency doctrine in places like Vietnam. And second, his exhibition was basically an early template for state-sponsored public persuasion, selling an empire to its own citizens back home. The difference is that in France, the government did that job openly and proudly. In America, that same job of manufacturing domestic support for overseas intervention would eventually get quietly outsourced to a covert agency, the CIA. Now for the big one. the name that shows up constantly in actual CIA memoirs and training materials. Thomas Edward Lawrence. You know him better as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was born in 1888, the illegitimate son of an Anglo-Irish nobleman. Brilliant kid, studied at Oxford, wrote his thesis on medieval crusader castles, and then joined an archaeological dig in Syria at a site called Carchemish. While it was still part of the Ottoman Empire, during those years in the field, he developed a genuine affection for the Arab people he worked alongside, and sympathy for their desire to break free of Ottoman rule. Then World War I breaks out. Lawrence joins British military intelligence in Cairo, and in 1916 he is sent to Arabia with a very specific job: link up with Arab fighters who had just launched a revolt against the Ottomans and help them fight. And he was extraordinarily good at it. He put on Bedouin robes, adapted to desert warfare, and helped lead a series of devastatingly effective guerrilla strikes against Ottoman and German targets. British forces eventually took Damascus in 1918. On the surface, total victories. Except behind the scenes, Britain had already secretly agreed with France to carve up Ottoman territory between themselves after the war, an arrangement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So the Arab fighters who trusted Lawrence and fought for independence did not actually get independence. Lawrence tried, and largely failed, to fix that at the post-war peace conference in Paris, though he did later help secure new kingdoms in Iraq and Transjordan for Arab leaders he had fought alongside, even if those kingdoms functioned as British client states in practice. Historians still argue about how much Lawrence's campaign actually mattered militarily, but intelligence experts broadly agree it was hugely significant, because Lawrence basically helped invent a whole new style of irregular warfare: small, mobile units moving like the desert Bedouin, along with early psychological warfare and deliberate deception operations designed to mislead enemy forces. But here is the honest truth, and it is straight from the book we are working from today. The main reason Lawrence became famous was not his tradecraft. It was image. It was branding. Even before the war ended, the British government realized there was enormous propaganda value in the story of a blonde young Englishman leading an Arab uprising. So the chief of British wartime propaganda arranged for an American journalist named Lowell Thomas to visit Lawrence's desert camp. After the war, Thomas turned that visit into a sensational series of illustrated public lectures. And just like that, Lawrence became an international celebrity. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia was, quite literally, a manufactured media product. And Lawrence had complicated feelings about his own fame. He tried to escape it, actually enlisting in the Royal Air Force under a fake name at one point. But he also could not fully resist it, and in 1926 he published his own epic account of the Desert Campaign, called 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Underneath the fame, there was real pain too. Lawrence struggled with the psychological aftereffects of the war, including a deeply traumatic assault he suffered while briefly held as a prisoner in 1917, and he battled depression for years afterward. He died in a motorcycle accident in 1935, at just 46 years old, and inevitably, given his life story, rumors of assassination followed him even into death. So Lawrence leaves behind this genuinely tangled legacy: pioneer of guerrilla warfare and psychological operations, media-made celebrity, sincere advocate for people whose independence his own government ultimately betrayed. A man who, according to some critics, exploited the aesthetics of another culture for his own image, essentially performing a role the way Kipling's fictional Kim did. All of that, wrapped into one real human being. And that entire package, hero, tragedy, tradecraft, and glamour together, is exactly what would later hook a whole generation of young Americans. Now time for a change of pace, because our next character is basically the opposite of a celebrity. No robes, no legend, no Hollywood biopic, just a tall, gloomy-looking American Army officer named Ralph Van Dieckman, who genuinely preferred working in total obscurity. And yet, in terms of direct organizational bloodline, he might matter to CIA history more than anyone else in this episode. Van Dieckman was born the same year as Kipling, 1865, in Ohio. Harvard graduate, tried law, tried medicine, ended up as an army surgeon. After helping suppress a violent miners' strike in the 1890s, he came away with a lasting suspicion of labor activism, a suspicion that would shape the rest of his career. In 1899, He arrives in the newly conquered Philippines and takes charge of something called the Bureau of Insurgent Records. He builds it into the U.S. Army's first real field intelligence unit, creating a massive card index of Filipinos resisting American occupation and upgrading the telegraph network to speed up battlefield intelligence. By the time he leaves in 1902, he has essentially built a functioning colonial surveillance state from scratch. Then comes the second act, and this is the important part. Van Diemen comes home and starts lobbying for America to have a proper, centralized military intelligence service, just like the one he built overseas. He finally gets it in 1917, when World War I pushes the Army to create a new military intelligence section under his command. And notice what he does. He borrows heavily from British intelligence structures, even using British naming conventions and spellings for his new branches. His method stays the same one he used in the Philippines, a giant surveillance database built from a mix of official sources and a network of citizen informants, in this case, a patriotic volunteer group called the American Protective League. But here is the uncomfortable twist. His targets are no longer Filipino insurgents overseas. They are now Americans at home. Pacifists, anarchists, German and Irish immigrants, Indian nationalists, and African Americans in particular became a recurring focus of his suspicion. In other words, the exact surveillance playbook built for a colony overseas came home and got pointed at minority communities inside the United States itself. Van Diemen retired from the Army in 1929, moved to a bungalow overlooking San Diego Bay, and just kept going as a private citizen, building a personal intelligence archive with help from his wife and quiet support from the Army. By the time he died in 1952, he had reportedly gathered files on roughly 250,000 Americans, material he is said to have shared informally with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and a young California politician named Richard Nixon. And there is a direct institutional thread here too. In 1940, Van Diemen met with Hoover and Army intelligence leadership and helped settle a jurisdictional split that still echoes today. The FBI would handle counterintelligence inside the Americas, and the military would handle it everywhere else in the world. During World War II, that overseas counterintelligence job passed to the Office of Strategic Services, and after the war, from the OSS straight into the brand new Central Intelligence Agency. So there really is a traceable organizational line running from a colonial surveillance program in the Philippines through one obsessive bureaucrat into CIA counterintelligence itself. So now we have four figures: Kipling the novelist, Lyautey the French general, Lawrence the celebrity guerrilla, and Van Diemen the quiet surveillance architect, individually. Interesting, but here is where it gets really fun, because the book shows us exactly how these four threads braided together inside the heads of the actual young men who built the CIA. A huge number of the Ivy League graduates who joined the CIA in its earliest years had passed through the same small handful of elite East Coast prep schools, and the most influential of all was Groton School in Massachusetts, founded in 1884 by a reverend named Endicott Peabody, who had himself been educated in England. Groton was soaked in the values of British imperial manhood, muscular Christianity, duty, and service. Theodore Roosevelt sent all four of his sons there, and personally showed up to chapel to tell the boys to render service to the state. Three of his grandsons, all Groton graduates, later joined the young CIA. And it was not just duty that pulled these young men in, it was pure adventure fantasy. Straight out of Kipling and Lawrence, Rufus Phillips, who later became an undercover agency operative in Vietnam, grew up in rural Virginia reading Kipling and dreaming about faraway, mysterious places. Another CIA officer working in Asia, the paramilitary specialist known as Tony Poe, later described Kim as basically one of the agency's own training manuals. Future CIA Director William Colby read 7 Pillars of Wisdom and openly fantasized about becoming a kind of Lawrence of Arabia figure himself. And Officer Dwayne Dewey Claridge, who would go on to play a major role in the Reagan era, called Lawrence, Indiana, one word, his hero. And this fascination was not just something these young Americans stumbled onto by accident. The British had been actively cultivating it since World War I, deliberately sending intelligence officers to charm influential young Americans, including a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then an assistant Navy secretary, whose youthful interest in espionage was personally encouraged by Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence. So by the time the CIA actually opens its doors in 1947, you have a whole leadership class of young American men who grew up worshipping British imperial heroes, absorbing French-style counterinsurgency thinking, and unknowingly inheriting a colonial surveillance toolkit from the Philippines. None of it was official CIA doctrine. Nobody wrote it into the founding charter. It arrived through bedtime stories, boarding school chapel, and boyhood hero worship, and it shaped how the agency saw the world for decades afterward. So the next time you hear the CIA described as a purely homegrown, purely American institution, remember this story. Remember the 1,200 British officials nervously ruling 300 million people in India? Remember the French generals spreading peace like a drop of oil? Right up until the moment it stopped working. Remember Lawrence in his desert robes? Turned into a media sensation, almost against his own will. And remember, quiet, obsessive Ralph Van Diemen, filing away Americans by the hundreds of thousands from a bungalow by the sea. None of these men ever worked a single day for the CIA. The agency did not even exist yet, but their fingerprints are all over its imagination, its methods, and its self-image, long before the first officer ever walked through the door. That is the CIA's secret ancestry. Not just American, British spies, French generals, imperial romance, baked in from the very beginning. Thanks for listening. See you next time.